14 men, 3 battered civilian cars, no body armor, no helmets, 2 of them wearing sandals they'd bought from a market stall in Basra for less than £2. They drove straight into a compound housing over 120 armed insurgents, and they didn't stop moving for 9 hours. When the Americans reviewed the after-action report the following morning, the senior liaison officer from Joint Special Operations Command sat in silence for almost 40 seconds before asking a single question: how are they all still alive? That wasn't rhetoric. It was genuine confusion. The answer to that question takes us into the most extraordinary period of British Special Forces operations since the Second World War. Between 2003 and 2009, a unit smaller than most American high school football teams dismantled the deadliest insurgent networks in Iraq with a speed, aggression, and sheer audacity that left the most powerful military on earth scrambling to understand what they were witnessing. The British Special Air Service, operating under the classified designation Task Force Black, conducted over 1,000 direct action raids in a single 18-month window. They hit targets night after night after night, sometimes 4 or 5 operations in a single evening, rotating teams through a kill chain so fast that insurgent cells couldn't reorganize before the next door was already being blown off its hinges. They did it with fewer than 60 operators at any given time. They did it in a city where American battalions of 800 soldiers struggled to hold single neighborhoods, and they did it so effectively that the commanding general of all American special operations in Iraq personally requested that British SAS teams be embedded at the tip of every major operation in Baghdad. That request was not born from diplomacy. It was born from results. To understand how 14 men in civilian clothes and market sandals ended up rewriting the rules of urban counterinsurgency, you have to understand what Iraq looked like in 2005. The country was disintegrating. The insurgency wasn't a single enemy. It was a hydra. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, was conducting a campaign of spectacular violence designed to trigger a sectarian civil war. Shia militias backed by Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force operatives were retaliating with death squads that dragged Sunni men from their homes and executed them in ditches. Criminal gangs exploited the chaos, kidnapping foreign contractors for ransoms reaching $2 million per hostage. And threading through all of it were the remnants of Saddam Hussein's intelligence apparatus, Ba'athist officers who understood tradecraft, counter-surveillance, and exactly how to build networks that Western intelligence couldn't penetrate. Baghdad in 2005 was recording over 1,000 violent deaths per month. Improvised explosive devices were detonating at a rate of roughly 80 per week. Coalition forces were losing soldiers almost daily, and the political pressure in both Washington and London was reaching a breaking point. The Americans had responded with scale: more troops, more armor, more firepower. Entire brigade combat teams of 4,000 soldiers were dedicated to single districts of Baghdad, rolling through in convoys of up-armored Humvees and Bradley Viking vehicles that weighed over 27 tons each. The footprint was enormous. The results were mixed at best. The British took one look at this and went the other direction entirely. The SAS contingent in Iraq at this time numbered between 40 and 60 operational personnel, supported by signals intelligence specialists, int analysts, and a small logistics tail. Their base was a compound in Baghdad that the Americans found almost comically austere, where US Special Operations teams had dedicated chow halls, recreation facilities, and air-conditioned planning rooms. The SAS compound looked like a stripped-down forward operating base from a much smaller war. Equipment was sparse. Vehicles were civilian. The operators moved around the city in battered Toyotas and Mitsubishi Pajeros that blended seamlessly into Baghdad traffic. There were no convoy procedures, no mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, no electronic countermeasure suites bolted to the chassis, just 4 men in a car, weapons concealed, driving into neighborhoods where the sight of a military vehicle would have sent every target running. This was not recklessness, this was doctrine. The philosophy came directly from the SAS's institutional DNA. The regiment had been built, from its founding in the North African desert in 1941, around a single idea: Small teams operating with surprise, speed, and violence of action could achieve effects completely disproportionate to their size. David Stirling's original L detachment had proven it against Rommel's airfields, destroying over 350 aircraft on the ground with teams of 4 and 5 men. The Malayan emergency had refined it further, with SAS patrols spending weeks in the jungle, unseen, building relationships with indigenous populations while hunting communist guerrillas. Oman in the 1970s had cemented it. Borneo, the Falklands, Northern Ireland, Sierra Leone. Every generation of the regiment had fought a different kind of war, and every single one had confirmed the same principle. Small is not a limitation. Small is the weapon. In Iraq, that philosophy collided with the most complex urban battle space on the planet, and it worked. The man who shaped Task Force Black's approach during its most intense period was a commanding officer whose name remains classified, but whose methods became legendary within the special operations community on both sides of the Atlantic. He understood something that many conventional commanders struggled to grasp. In a counterinsurgency fought among a civilian population of over 7 million people, the most dangerous thing you can be is visible. Every armored convoy that roared through a Baghdad intersection announced its presence to every insurgent spotter within a kilometer radius. Every helicopter that orbited overhead told the enemy exactly where to avoid. The Americans' technological superiority, their greatest asset in conventional warfare, had become a liability in the warren of concrete alleyways and crowded markets where Al-Qaeda's cell leaders hid. The SAS flipped the equation. They became invisible. Operators grew beards. Some grew them long enough to pass, at a distance, for Iraqi men. They wore local clothing when the tactical situation demanded it. Dish-dasher robes over concealed plate carriers, sandals or cheap trainers instead of combat boots. The flip-flop detail that gives this story its most memorable image wasn't universal, but it was real. Multiple accounts from American liaison officers and British military journalists confirm that SAS operators were observed conducting pre-assault reconnaissance in local footwear, blending into market crowds, sitting in tea shops within 200 meters of target buildings, watching, counting, mapping entry points and exit routes, while the people around them had no idea that the most dangerous soldiers in the city were sipping chai at the next table. One American Delta Force operator, speaking years later to journalist Sean Naylor for his book on Joint Special Operations Command, described watching a 4-man SAS team prepare for a raid. They looked like they were going to a barbecue, he said. Shorts, sandals, t-shirts, pistols tucked in their waistbands. We were kitting up with 60 pounds of body armor and NODs and radios, and they just walked out the door. I thought they were going to get killed. They came back 3 hours later with 4 detainees and a hard drive full of intelligence that took us 2 weeks to exploit. That quote captures the culture shock perfectly, but it obscures the reality of what was happening underneath the apparently casual exterior. Every SAS operator in Iraq had completed a selection process that eliminates over 90% of candidates. The regiment draws primarily from the Parachute Regiment and Royal Marines, though soldiers from any CAT badge can attempt selection. The course itself lasts approximately 5 months. The first phase, known as the Hills, involves progressively longer marches across the Brecon Beacons in South Wales, carrying Bergen rucksacks that increase in weight from around 25 kilograms to over 29 kilograms plus weapon and belt kit, navigating alone between grid references in all weather conditions. The final march, known as Endurance, covers 64 kilometers, with a Bergen weighing approximately 29 kilograms, plus rifle, and must be completed in under 20 hours. Men have died on this march. The beacons kill. Hypothermia, heat exhaustion, navigational errors that leave candidates wandering in whiteout conditions on exposed ridgelines at altitudes exceeding 880 meters. Those who survive the hills enter continuation training, which includes standard and advanced infantry tactics, demolitions, close-quarter battle drills, signals, combat medicine, and the infamous resistance to interrogation phase, where candidates endure simulated capture and sustain psychological pressure designed to test their ability to resist revealing information under extreme duress. The details of this phase are classified, But former candidates have described sleep deprivation lasting over 36 hours, stress positions, sensory deprivation, and interrogation techniques that push men to their absolute psychological limits. Some break, many break. The ones who don't go on to the next phase. By the time an SAS operator arrived in Iraq, he had typically served 6 to 10 years in the military, completed the most demanding selection course in the Western world, undergone specialist training in hostage rescue, covert surveillance, explosive method of entry, advanced driving, combat shooting at a level that consumed over 100,000 rounds per year per squadron, and language training. He had almost certainly deployed on operations before Iraq, Northern Ireland, Sierra Leone, Afghanistan, the Balkans. These were not young soldiers experiencing combat for the first time. They were professionals at the peak of a system designed over 6 decades to produce exactly this kind of operator. So when they walked out the door in sandals and t-shirts, they weren't being cavalier, they were being precise. The clothing was a tactical choice. The minimal kit was a calculated decision based on the specific threat environment. And the apparent casualness masked a level of individual skill and team cohesion that made heavy equipment redundant. The mechanics of a task force black operation in Baghdad during the 2005 to 2008 period followed a pattern that became known within the coalition as the unblinking eye. It started with intelligence. Signals intelligence from GCHQ intercepts, human intelligence from agents recruited by the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, surveillance footage from unmanned aerial vehicles orbiting above the city at altitudes where they were invisible to the naked eye, tips from Iraqi informants, data exploited from previous raids, hard drives, mobile phones, documents, fingerprints, and DNA samples processed through a biometric database that eventually contained records on over 1 million individuals. The intelligence would identify a target, a cell leader, a bomb maker, a financier, a facilitator who moved foreign fighters across the Syrian border. The target would be located sometimes to a specific building, sometimes to a neighborhood. And then the SAS would move. The planning cycle was extraordinarily compressed. Where American special operations teams might take 24 to 72 hours to plan a deliberate raid, the SAS were frequently launching within 3 to 4 hours of receiving actionable intelligence. In some cases, the cycle was under 90 minutes. This speed was the decisive advantage. Insurgent networks knew that if they stayed in one location too long, they would be found. They moved constantly. But the SAS moved faster. A typical operation would begin after dark. 4 to 8 operators in 2 civilian vehicles, driving through Baghdad traffic, following routes that had been scouted hours earlier. No sirens, no convoy, no electronic jammers screaming on every frequency and alerting every insurgent with a radio scanner that special operations forces were in the area. Just 2 cars, threading through the city like any other traffic. The approach to the target building was the most dangerous phase. The SAS used a technique they called the silent approach, driving to within 200 to 400 meters of the target, then dismounting and moving on foot through the streets. In a city where gunfire was background noise and the sound of boots on concrete after midnight meant only one thing, this required extraordinary nerve. The teams moved in pairs, covering each other through alleyways and across intersections, using the shadows and the urban geography to stay invisible until they were at the door. Entry was explosive and instantaneous daily. Frame charges on the door, flashbang grenades through the breach, 4 men flowing into the building in a choreography so rehearsed it was almost mechanical. Room by room, floor by floor, clearing with controlled pairs of operators, each man responsible for a specific arc of fire, each transition practiced so many thousands of times in the killing house at the regiment's Hereford base that it was pure muscle memory. The violence inside these buildings was close range and extreme. Rooms were small, corridors were narrow, distances between the operators and the enemy were measured in meters, sometimes less. The SAS operators fired their weapons, typically Colt Canada C8 carbines or Heckler & Koch MP5 submachine guns with suppressors, at ranges where they could see the expressions on their targets' faces. There was no margin for error. A missed shot in a room full of people, some of whom might be civilians, some of whom might be women or children, being used as human shields, required a level of discriminatory shooting that only the most highly trained soldiers in the world could deliver under that kind of pressure. And they delivered it night after night after night. During the peak of Task Force Black's operations in 2007, the unit was averaging roughly one raid per night, with periods where they conducted multiple operations in a single evening. The intelligence exploitation from each raid fed directly into the next target. A mobile phone seized at midnight would be cracked by 0200 hours, revealing contacts, locations, and communication patterns that identified the next link in the network. By 0400, a new team would be briefed and rolling toward the next target. By dawn, 2 or 3 nodes of an insurgent network might have been rolled up in a single night. The insurgents called it the night raids. They feared the darkness because the darkness belonged to the SAS. One particular operation in late 2006 illustrates the methodology with brutal clarity. Intelligence identified a senior Al-Qaeda in Iraq logistics coordinator operating from a residential compound in a neighborhood in southwest Baghdad. The compound was large, multiple buildings within a walled perimeter, estimated 12 to 15 occupants, at least 8 of whom were assessed as armed combatants. The target himself was known to wear a suicide vest and had standing orders to detonate rather than be captured. Surveillance confirmed the target was present. The clock started. The assault team was 8 men, 2 4-man teams. They drove to the area in 2 vehicles, a white Toyota sedan and a gray Mitsubishi pickup truck, both so common on Baghdad streets as to be essentially invisible. They parked 300 meters from the compound on a residential street, dismounted and moved on foot. The streets were empty. It was approximately 01:30 hours. The temperature was still over 30 degrees Celsius even at that hour, the residual heat of a Baghdad summer radiating off concrete walls and asphalt. The first team approached the compound's main gate. The second team moved to a side wall where aerial surveillance had identified a lower section suitable for scaling. At a synchronized mark, both teams breached simultaneously. The main gate was blown with a strip charge. The side wall was scaled with a collapsible aluminium ladder. 8 men poured into the compound from 2 directions. The first contact came within 4 seconds. An armed sentry in the courtyard, already alerted by the detonation, raised an AK-47 variant. He was shot twice in the chest at a range of approximately 11 meters by the point man of the first team. The team flowed past his falling body without breaking stride. Building 1 was cleared in under 90 seconds. 3 combatants were engaged and neutralized. 2 women and 4 children were found in a back room, unharmed and secured by the rear pair of the team. Building 2 was the crisis point. The target was inside. As the entry team stacked on the door, a burst of automatic fire came through the thin plasterboard wall from inside, missing the lead operator by what he later estimated as less than 30 centimeters. The team adjusted instantly, breaching the wall itself rather than the door, detonating a mousehole charge that blew a man-sized opening through the plaster and concrete block. They entered through the dust cloud, visibility near 0, firing at muzzle flashes in the darkness. The target was found in a back bedroom, alive, his suicide vest partially armed. An SAS operator tackled him physically, pinning his hands away from the detonation switch, while the second operator cut the wires with a set of trauma shears he carried specifically for this purpose. The entire compound was secured in under 4 minutes. 5 combatants killed. The primary target captured alive with his suicide vest intact, providing an intelligence windfall that led to 6 further raids over the following 72 hours. 8 SAS operators. 0 friendly casualties. 3 of the operators were wearing trainers. 1 was wearing sandals he'd bought in a Basra market. When the American liaison team reviewed the operation, they noted something remarkable in the after-action report. The SAS team had expended a total of 37 rounds across the entire engagement. 37 rounds, 8 men, multiple rooms, 5 enemy killed, a suicide bomber subdued, and they'd used fewer bullets than a single American rifleman might expend in a 10-second firefight. That economy of violence wasn't just impressive marksmanship. It was a reflection of something deeper, a level of control under pressure that comes only from years of training and operational experience that most soldiers never accumulate in an entire career. The Americans noticed. They more than noticed. They studied it. General Stanley McChrystal, commanding Joint Special Operations Command during this period, has been extensively quoted on the impact of the British SAS on coalition operations in Iraq. In his memoir and in multiple interviews, McChrystal described the SAS contribution as essential and credited the British with pioneering the rapid exploitation cycle that became the backbone of the coalition's counterinsurgency strategy. The concept of hitting a target, immediately exploiting the captured intelligence, and launching a follow-on operation within hours was not an American invention. It was an SAS innovation, born from the regiment's experience in Northern Ireland, where the rapid exploitation of seized materials from provisional IRA arms caches had been refined over 3 decades of operations. McChrystal's own unit, Delta Force, had enormous respect for the SAS. The 2 units had trained together for years, exchanging personnel and tactics. But in Iraq, the cultural differences were stark. Delta Force operated with a logistical and technological support structure that dwarfed anything the British could field. American special operations teams had dedicated intelligence squadrons, their own aviation assets, including modified Black Hawk and Chinook helicopters, real-time video feeds from multiple drone platforms, and a budget that ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars annually. The SAS had a fraction of that support. Their helicopter assets were limited and shared with other British forces. Their drone coverage was intermittent. Their budget was classified, but estimated at a tiny percentage of what JSOC spent. And yet, pound for pound, operator for operator, the SAS consistently matched or exceeded the output of American units that had 5 to 10 times their resources. During the most intense period of operations, Task Force Black was responsible for roughly a third of all high-value target captures in Baghdad, despite representing less than 5% of the total special operations force in the city. That ratio, that absurd, almost impossible ratio, is the number that made American commanders sit up and pay attention. The explanation lies not in some mystical British superiority, but in specific, identifiable differences in training, culture, and approach. The SAS trained its operators to be self-sufficient to a degree that American special operations, with their deeper support structures, did not always require. An SAS 4-man team was expected to plan its own operations, drive its own vehicles, navigate its own routes, breach its own doors, clear its own rooms, provide its own first aid, exploit its own intelligence, and extract under its own power. The team carried everything it needed and relied on nobody else to deliver it to the fight. This self-sufficiency meant that when things went wrong, and things always go wrong, the team could adapt without waiting for external support. There was no callback to a tactical operations center asking for guidance. There was no request for a quick reaction force to be spun up. The 4 men at the door made the decisions, executed the plan, and dealt with whatever the enemy threw at them, using nothing but their own weapons, their own training, and each other. The flip-flop detail, which has become almost legendary in special operations circles, encapsulates this philosophy perfectly. American operators looked at the SAS and saw men who appeared under-equipped, under-supported, and under-protected. What they were actually seeing was the product of a military culture that valued capability over comfort, effect over appearance, and results over resources. The Sandals weren't a fashion statement. They were a tactical decision. In certain neighborhoods of Baghdad, particularly in the dense residential areas of Sada City and the Sunni districts of western Baghdad, the sound of military boots on pavement at 2 in the morning was a death sentence for surprise. Soft-soled footwear on concrete is nearly silent. The SAS chose their footwear the same way they chose everything else, based on what would give them the greatest advantage in the specific environment they were operating in. It cost them in protection. There's no pretending otherwise. Operators in sandals and t-shirts had no blast protection against IEDs, no ballistic protection against gunfire, no ankle support for the kind of dynamic movement that close-quarter battle demands. They accepted that risk because they calculated, correctly, that speed, surprise, and silence would protect them more effectively than any amount of Kevlar. In the mathematics of urban raiding, not being seen is worth more than being bulletproof. That calculation was validated by the casualty figures. Over the entire period of Task Force Black's operations in Iraq, which spanned roughly 6 years of continuous deployment, the SAS suffered remarkably few fatalities relative to the volume and intensity of operations conducted. Exact figures remain classified, but open-source reporting and accounts from journalists, including Mark Urban, whose book Task Force Black remains the most authoritative public account of SAS operations in Iraq, indicate that fatal casualties among SAS operators in Iraq numbered in the single digits. Single digits, over more than 1,000 operations, in the most dangerous city on Earth. Compare that to the broader coalition casualty figures. Over 4,400 American service members were killed in Iraq between 2003 and 2011. British forces lost 179. The SAS, conducting the most dangerous type of operation, direct action raids against hardened insurgent targets in urban environments, lost fewer men than many individual infantry platoons that saw far less combat. That is not luck, that is mastery. The impact of Task Force Black extended far beyond the individual raids. The intelligence generated by the SAS operations fed a network effect that accelerated across the entire coalition. Every raid produced materials, every set of materials produced leads, every lead produced targets, and every target, once hit, produced more materials. The cycles spun faster and faster, and the insurgent networks couldn't keep up. By 2008, Al-Qaeda in Iraq's leadership structure had been so thoroughly shredded by the combined efforts of Task Force Black and American JSOC elements that the organization was functionally decapitated. Zarqawi himself had been killed in June 2006, located through a combination of intelligence streams that included significant SAS contributions. His successors lasted months, sometimes weeks before they too were captured or killed. The Shia militias fared no better. The SAS conducted operations against Iranian-backed special groups with the same ferocity, seizing weapons caches that included explosively formed penetrators, a particularly lethal type of roadside bomb manufactured in Iran and smuggled across the border. These operations were politically sensitive. Britain had no desire to provoke a direct confrontation with Iran, and the SAS was ordered to conduct these raids with an even greater emphasis on stealth and deniability than usual. They complied. Operations against militia targets were conducted with such discretion that in several cases, the militias didn't realize they'd been hit by a foreign special forces team at all, attributing the raids to rival Iraqi factions. That level of operational security, maintaining invisibility while conducting kinetic operations in a city saturated with informants, surveillance and hostile intelligence services, is arguably the SAS's most impressive achievement in Iraq. The regiment operated in Baghdad for years. They conducted over 1,000 raids, and yet there is almost no photographic evidence of their presence. No captured operators, no compromised safe houses, no significant intelligence breach that led to a catastrophic ambush. The insurgents knew someone was hitting them. They knew it was special forces. But the specific identity, locations, and methods of Task Force Black remained opaque to the enemy throughout the entire campaign. American Special Operations personnel who served alongside the SAS in Iraq have been among the most vocal in acknowledging what they witnessed. A retired Delta Force operator, interviewed for a documentary about coalition special operations, put it this way: "Those guys operated in a way that made us question every assumption we had about how you have to do this job. We'd show up to a joint planning session, and they'd have half the guys we had, a quarter of the equipment, and no air support, and they'd get the same result or better. It was humbling, and then you'd find out one of them had done the whole thing in flip-flops, and you just shake your head." The legacy of Task Force Black's operations in Iraq has been profound and lasting. The rapid exploitation cycle, pioneered by the SAS, became standard operating procedure across the entire JSOC enterprise. The concept of find, fix, finish, exploit, analyze, the operational methodology that drove the coalition's counterinsurgency campaign from 2007 onward, was built directly on the framework that the SAS had been practicing since Northern Ireland. American Special Operations units adopted and adapted British techniques for covert urban movement, intelligence-led targeting, and compressed planning cycles. The student became the teacher, and then the teacher learned from the student, and the result was a combined capability that neither nation could have achieved alone. But the origin of that capability, the seed from which it grew, was a small group of British soldiers who understood something fundamental about warfare that bigger, richer, more technologically advanced forces sometimes forget. War is not won by the force with the most equipment. It is won by the force that best understands the environment it is fighting in and adapts everything, tactics, equipment, appearance, footwear, to match that environment with absolute precision. The SAS adapted. They grew beards when beards made them invisible. They wore local clothes when local clothes kept them alive. They drove battered cars when battered cars got them to the target undetected. And yes, they wore sandals when sandals were the right tool for the job. 14 men, 3 civilian cars, 0 body armor on some of them, over 100 enemy fighters in the compound. 9 hours, no friendly casualties. The Americans asked how they were all still alive. The answer wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It wasn't some uniquely British bravery that other nations lacked. It was 60 years of institutional knowledge compressed into a 4-man team that knew exactly what it could do, exactly what the enemy couldn't do, and exactly which pair of shoes to wear to prove the difference. The most sophisticated special operations unit in British history walked into the most dangerous city on earth wearing market sandals, and they walked out carrying the intelligence that helped break the insurgency. 37 rounds, 5 enemies killed, 1 suicide bomber taken alive, 0 casualties. Some armies measure capability in billions spent and battalions deployed. The SAS measured it in the silence between the breach and the first shot, and in the flip-flops they wore to get there.